Dr. Stefan D. Krashen is the one who facilitated research in second language acquisition, bilingual education, and in reading. He believes that the language acquisition requires a meaningful interaction with the target of the language. He also theorized that there are five hypotheses to the second language acquisition which have been very influential in the field of second language research and in teaching. The first one is acquisition learning hypothesis. So, when we say acquisition learning hypothesis, the author said that there is a distinction between language acquisition and language learning. So, when we say language acquisition, the students acquires language unconsciously. This is similar to when a child picks up their first language. It requires a meaningful interaction in the target of the language, or it is called a natural communication in which speakers are concentrated not in the form of their utterances but in the communicative act. On the other hand, language learning happens when the student is consciously discovering and learning the rules and the grammaticals of the structures of the language. The learned system or learning is the product of a formal instruction, and it comprises conscious process in which results in a conscious knowledge about the language. So, for example, knowledge of the rules of a grammars. So, a deductive approach in a teacher-centered setting produces a learning, while the inductive approach in the student-centered setting leads to acquisition. And is the monitor hypothesis. So, when we say monitor hypothesis, it states that the learner is consciously learning the grammar rules and the function of a language rather than its meaning. So this theory focuses more on the correctness of the language. To use the monitor hypothesis properly, there are three standards must be met. So the first one is the acquirer must know the rules of the language. Second, the acquirer must concentrate on the exact form of the language. Then third, the acquirer must set aside some time to review and apply the language rules in a conversation. Although, this is a tricky one because in a regular conversation, there's hardly enough to ensure the correctness of a language. But Krashen also suggests there is an individual variation among language learners with regard to the monitor use. So he distinguished learners that use monitor all over the time is classified as overusers. For a given language, some grammatical rules tend to be acquired early while others are late. Is the natural order hypothesis. So natural order hypothesis is basically based on the finding that the language learners are learn grammatical structures and effects and universal ways. So there is a sense of predictability happened to this kind of learning. So which is similar to how a speaker learns their first language. So Krashen, the author, however, points out that the implication of a natural order hypothesis is not that language program syllables should be based on the order found in the study. In fact, he regrets grammatical consequencing with the goal of when the goal is the language acquisition. So those learners who have learned or who prefer not to use their concise knowledge, he categorized as underusers, and those learners who use the monitor approximately, he categorized as optimal users. Fourth is the input hypothesis. So when we say input hypothesis, it places more emphasis on the acquisition of the second language. So this theory is more concerned about how the language is acquired rather than learned. Moreover, the input hypothesis is only concerned with acquisition, not in learning. So according to this hypothesis, the learners improve and progress along the natural order when he or she receives second language input that is one step beyond his or her current stage of linguistic competence. So for example, if a learner is not a stage of I, then acquisition takes place when he or she is exposed to a comprehensible input that belongs to the level I plus 1. Since not all of the learners can be at the same level of linguistic competence at the same time, so Krashen suggests that the natural communicative input is the key to designing a syllables, ensuring in this way that the learner will receive some I plus 1 input that is appropriate for his or her current stage of linguistic competence. So, moreover, the input hypothesis states that the learner naturally develops language as soon as the student receives interesting and fun information. The fifth or the last hypothesis is affective filter hypothesis. In affective filter, language acquisition can be affected by emotional factors. If the affective filter is higher, then the student is less likely to learn the language. So, therefore, the learning environment for the student must be positive and stress-free. So, the student is open for input. So, these variables include motivation, self-confidence, anxiety, and personal traits. So, Krashen claims that the learners with high motivation, a self-confidence, a good image, a low level of anxiety, and extroversion are better equipped for success in a second language acquisition. So, low motivation, low self-esteem, anxiety, introversion, and exhibition can raise the affective filter and from a mental block that prevents comprehensible input from being used for their acquisition. In other words, when the filter is up, it impedes language acquisition. On the other hand, positive effect is necessary but not sufficient on its own for acquisition to take place. So, those are the 5 hypotheses of Krashen's theory of second language acquisition. So, I hope that you learned something from this video. Thank you and God bless us all.